Good morning, my name is Bhavyashri. Now I want to talk about error handling. So whenever we try to build any application, we will get so many errors in there. That means maybe compile time errors or maybe runtime errors. Compile time errors there itself only will solve, but if it is like if you get any runtime errors, then you have to solve them properly. Otherwise, user will see some unexpected page and there he will not understand what is going there. So I want to explain this error handling using my mini application called user registration. This is my user controller. So whenever the request it's the so whenever user tries to make a registration, then first request comes to this controller. So after coming to this controller, the controller will just redirect the request to the service layer where the actual logic will be built. So this is my service layer. So this is my service layer, register service implementation, where I am writing the actual logic. So here I am checking the validations. So I'll do some validations check. Means, for example, I have taken username validation checker and password validation checker here. So whenever if these are valid, then the user make a registration. Otherwise, he will not able to make the registration. This type of coding I want to do. So first of all, I will run this one. So it is running successfully on the port 8080. So I'll run this using Postman. We can run on browser also, but by default it is only takes the get type method. So if you use post, we can able to change the HTTP codes here, sorry, HTTP methods here. In this way we can change. So this is my URL. So I'm passing the request like this. So I'll enter this one now, and I'm getting some successful response. Here after doing all validations in my service layer, so this is my service layer. So after doing all validations, it is generating some response and it is returning the same response back to the controller, and controller is just displaying this response. So this response is going to the user. So whenever is everything is fine, then we will send this type of successful response. But if anything fail, then we have to send the error response, because the same response if you send, then user may think that he did well and we will get some invalid data. So I want to send error response as per the error response and success response as per the flow it is happening. So here I have user response. So this is my user response. When everything is fine, then I am sending this successful response. This user response I am sending as a successful response. But when something goes might wrong, then we have to send the error response. But if in case if you write same values here also, for example, whenever any errors came, then I want to send the error code and error message. Then he will understand neatly whatever the mistake he did. So if I write something like this, error message and error code, So these two fields I want to send as a response, but if in case if I write these fields in the same user response, these two also will go and he will not understand. Sometimes it is showing these two null and sometimes it will show these two null. So this type of response I don't want to send. So I want to make it in different class. I want to write these fields in different class in order to understand to the user. So whenever it is successful, then I want to send this user response as successful response, but whenever it is failed, then I want to send some error response with these two fields, error code and the error message. So with these two fields I want to send a message. So first of all I will create the class. Something error response. So this is the error response that I want to send to the user whenever he made any mistakes, or even though if any code related issue is there in our application, then I want to send this type of error code and error message to the user. Then he can easily understand by seeing that error code. We'll maintain some codes according to our application that what we are making, because for example if I am doing this user registration, I'll just simply choose some 1000 to 2000 error codes. Then if I'm making login form, any login application, then I'll choose some 2000 to 3000 error codes. So by seeing the error code only we can easily understand in which application or in which microservice that we got the error. So in this case I want to use some error codes, but here after registration is successful, so if everything went, wait a second, so in service layer if everything is fine, then it is passing the user response. But if anything happens, like if any error came in the middle of the validation checker, then there only I want to stop the execution and I want to send the error response there. But here I haven't taken that validate method. Here I am validating by using this validate method. In every validation checker I am using some validate method, and that all validation checkers is implementing the validation interface. So there I define this validate method. So in every validation checker I am just overriding it and making my own implementation. So every time after checking this one, I am not returning any return type, like I am not returning any type here. So it just simply with no return type. So if I do like this in for loop, even if I want to check whether it is right or wrong, I can't do that one. So it just simply checks, and if it is fails, even though if one thing is fails, it just continue with the next validation checker. So in username validation checker, something like I'll write like this. So I am taking this username and I just want to print in log file. And after that I want to check whether this is meeting my criteria or not. Here I will check the length. So it cannot be null and it cannot be less than 5 of length. So this type of statement I want to print. Here if anything goes wrong, then it will throw an exception. So if I run this one now, as of now it is not it is passing username, so it will not do any, it will not throw any exception here. So if I don't pass username, again I will hit the one. Here itself it is stopping, so I don't take this one. I'll take only one condition here, then it will throw an exception. So this type of exception it is throwing. So by seeing this one, user will not understand what is happening here. So we have to send some proper message with some proper code, like the where we define some error code and error response here. So this type of error response I want to send, but in service class it is returning the user response only. At last, even though if anything happens here, if any error related or exception related things are there in validation check, then it is throwing like this. There itself it is stopping, but it is showing this type of message which will not understand by the user. So whenever it wants to stop, at that time I want to say some error code and error message by sending the error response, then user will understand clearly, okay, what the mistake is happened, or even though through error code we can understood what the thing happened there, so what changes we have to do. So every time whenever any error gives, I want to send that response. So what I will do, wherever the error occurred in the entire application, I'll just throw that exception with my custom exception, because if I use the predefined exception, here I am using a predefined exception, here this exception has to be caught by the or handled by the caller method. This is the calling method. So this method is calling by some other method, something called service layer. The service layer in this file registration, this register user method is calling that method like this. So it is not handling that request. So if it is not handling, then it will go to the user controller, and here also we are not handling, and this is the last one. So if anything, any exception is thrown in the application, if it is not handled by the caller, then it will be handled by the at last one, means Spring will handle automatically, and Spring is providing some default functionality like this, so which is not easily understood to the user. So that's why I want to say to handle the exceptions by myself. So I will say to Spring that whatever the exception will got, so handle through my custom exceptions. So I will create some custom exception here in order to do that one. So I will use some validation custom exception or any exception. So if I want to say this as a is exception, then I have to extend this one with exception or runtime exception. So then it will become the exception. As of now, if it is not there, so until and unless we don't write this exception, it behaves like a normal class. So when we want to make any custom exception, then we will have to extend our class with the runtime exception. Then only it will become the exception child class. So it is now the child class of runtime exception, and runtime exception is the child class of exception. So I'll generate some fields here also. Here instead of using that one, I'll only write all the things. So I'll use some constructor here. And I have to use setter and getter methods. Because whenever I want to throw this exception, at that time I have to use this value. So I need these setters and getter methods. Now everything is fine. So this whenever any error is going in our entire application, then I want to throw this exception. So if I throw this type of exception every time, then Spring will understand, okay, this type of error code and error message that we have to generate, because it will understand by the user. So it will not perform the default functionality that whatever it performing here, so it will perform as per our requirement. So in user registration form, in user validation checker, instead of throwing some illegal argument predefined exception here, so I will throw my exception. So I have to pass two arguments here. Now everything is fine. Now if I run this one, still it will not be handled by it will only handle by the Spring, and it will provide same type of error. First of all, I'll run, then I'll say why it is happening. So same thing is happening even though if I am handling this one. Here I am throwing, but this thrown exception is not again handled by any of the caller method in my application. So this method, this validate method, is calling by the service layer. Here registration service implementation is calling that method. Here it is not handling, and user controller is handling this register user method, and this is also not handling. Same thing if user controller is also not user controller, maybe if the controller is also not handling the request, then at last the Spring only handle that exception, and it will perform some default functionality. Something it will provide some timestamp, status, error, this type of functionality it will provide to the user, and it is handled in this way. So I don't want to send the default functionality to the user. So what I'll do, so I'll make some global exception also. So I have to say to the Spring, whatever the exception is thrown by the entire application, that have to be handled by this validation exception. So I'll create one more class in order to handle that exception. This validation exception also I'll place here only. Now this is the class. Here I'll tell to the Spring whatever the exception is raised in the entire application, that has to be handled via a validation exception. So in order to say this, there is one annotation called @controller advice. So whenever Spring sees this annotation, then if any caller method is not handling the request, for example, so I have username validation checker. This is my username validation checker. So this is my username validation checker. So here it is throwing the exception. If the condition is not meeting, it is throwing some new validation exception. It is throwing with some proper error code and error message. So it is throwing the exception. So it is under the validate method. So in validate method, while validating the things, if anything, if any error came, then it is throwing this type of exception. Now this method is called by the service layer. This is the registration service implementation class. So their validate method is calling every time for all the validation checkers. With some reference, it is calling the validate method. Here it is not handling, and there is one more class called user controller. This is the user controller, and it is calling the registration service user. It's some RSA reference. So here this controller is calling service layer, and service layer is calling validation checkers one by one, not only this one, so many validation checkers it is calling. So whenever any error is happening, it is throwing the validation exception with some error code and error message. Here it is not handling, and here also it is not handling. So if these two are not handling, by default Spring will handle that one, and it is providing this type of default message. So I'll say to the Spring, whatever the exception is thrown here, handle it by using this user controller advice class. So here I created one more class, something called a global exception handler. So whatever the entire application. If any exception raised, that has to be handled by this class. In order to say this one, I will annotate this one with @controller advice. So as soon as the Spring will see this one, so it will not handle by itself, it will pass that handling response to this global exception handler. So it will handle that exception, whatever the exception thrown in the application, that will be handled by this class. So in order to say this one, I have to write one method. We have to say to that class, handle the exception there by using some annotation. First of all, I'll write that annotation, something called exception handler. So this is the annotation. In that one, we have to mention which exception is has to handle here. So I want to handle my custom exception called validation exception. So this exception I want to handle. So I am saying to the Spring, so whenever exception is raised, instead of handling by the Spring by using some default functionality, use this class to handle that exception by using this exception handler method. So whatever the exception class that we have mentioned here, so that type of exception is handled here by using this method. So first of all, I will write method, something called handle validation exception. So here I want to handle it. So I want to send at last the whatever error code and error response that I want to send. In Java, there is one class called response entity. There, whatever the error response that we want to send, that class we can mention as a return type here. So if you write something like this, then the error response will send back to the user. So first of all, I have to fill these values in the error response. There are some fields called error code and error response. First of all, I have to fill that one. Here, instead of writing this one, what I'll do this exception class error code and error messages here. Here also I'll use that exception message. So I have used this error response here, and whatever the exception is raised, so it will come to this class with the same reference. So in my user validation checker, it is throwing the exception. So I am throwing validation exception with some error code and error message. The same reference will come here to the global exception. So it is now having the error code and error message with 1001 and username missing message. Those values I am setting in the error response, and at last I am just returning that response. So in this way I can handle the error response also. If now I just hit enter, here I have to take less than, then I have to say whenever it is less than 5, then I have to throw that exception. Now everything is fine. I'll run this one once again. Okay, I understood. Here I'm not taking the username. Here I'm not taking the username. Here it will get null exception. So as soon as it is throwing the null object, on null object I am using some operation called length method. So on null object, if I use any operations, then I'll get null pointer exception. So there itself it is throwing an exception while checking the condition. So that's why it is throwing something like this. It is not coming to the if body, and here only while checking the condition only it is hitting the error and it is throwing that null pointer exception. What I'll do, I'll just pass this one, and here I'll take something called Sri. Now it will enter into the body and it will give this type of message. But if I want to handle, if it is giving the null, that null pointer exception also I want to handle, because if it is coming to this body, then it will throw you the violation exception and it is handled by my global exception handler. But if it is throwing any null pointer exception or any array index of bond exception, so these type of predefined exceptions are raised. At that time I want to handle that type of exceptions also. So in username it is not coming into the body, so before that here only the exception is raised. I want to handle that type of exception also. So if I write something like this, the same thing, and here I can take something called null pointer exception, and here also I'll say some generic exception called null pointer exception. Here I will write manually. So if I run this one now without passing this one, then it will give me this type of code, because same thing likewise that we are handling the custom exception, now I am handling the null pointer exception. So if I hit enter, now it is showing something null pointer exception occurred. But if I want to write or if I want to handle all the predefined exceptions like this, then I have to write so many methods here, because not only null pointer exception, maybe in such cases we may get the IO exceptions or server related exceptions or DB related exceptions or array related exceptions, array index out of bound exception or class cast exception. So many type of exceptions are there. So instead of handling all the exceptions one by one, we can use the parent class here. So if I take exception here, so whatever exception is occurring here, that will be handled by the parent class, because all the exceptions are child classes of this exception. So I can use that advantage, and instead of writing null pointer exception, I can handle exception only. So whatever the exception is rising, whenever if any code is wrong, or maybe if I'm using any unrelated data or invalid data, then at that time that exception will be raised here and it will be caught by this global exception class only if I use this exception handler here. So instead of this one, I'll say it's a generic exception. So now this method only handles that null pointer exception, but now the error code and error message has changed. So by seeing this one, if it is not giving any data related messages, then by seeing this code, user will understood, okay, this type of error code I am getting with this proper message. So solve this one. So if user says that this type of error code that I am getting, then developer will understand, okay, here something generic error is coming, that means which is not specific to our custom exception. So by seeing this log files, so after saying that one, by seeing this log files, he can understand where the mistake happened here. So here it will give the proper message like this. Then he will understand by seeing this console file. So this is the way we can handle the error and exceptions. But here I am writing something like 1000 and some messages to say that user, okay, this type of error code, to give the response as error response, I am writing some error code and error message. But if I write like this, then it will become a hard coding. So I don't want to do this type of messages and codes here. Instead of that one, I want to use another class to where there itself I'll initialize all these values, and I'll use that class in order to send the error code and error message. I'll use that class where I'll get the values. So I'll create one mapping here. So I'll use enum. So same thing that I have taken there, so same fields I can take in enum as a mapping type in the constant. So enum is nothing but the group of constants where we can define our own data types. So I'll take some proper names for that one. So I'll take the same values here. And for generic error, so except this custom errors or customized exceptions, apart from that, if any error happen, I'll say that it has a generic error or system error. So I have to write the constructor also, because This is act like a constant reference with some arguments. So I have to define some constructor also. Now, as these are private fields, I have to write some getter fields here. So instead of writing like this, in here I am using hard coded values. So instead of that one, I can use that error enum. Now instead of hard coded values, I am using the advantage of error, where we can mention the mapping there with some error code and error message. And here in global exception also, instead of this generic message and generic code, I'll use the generic constant here. Now everything is fine. So if I pass this one, so this type of error code and error message is coming. So what I'll do, in username validation checker, so I'll write some code. So whenever it is null or empty, then I want to say it is the username is missing, and that type of error code and error message I want to send. And if it is of length less than 5, then I want to use some other value or some other error code and error message here. Now I'll throw exception here also. So here I'll define some other error name Actually this constant is not there, so I'll define that constant also. So I have to define this one. Now if the user didn't pass the message, then he will get the username is missing or null. So this type of error message he is getting. So if he is passing the username and if it is still less than 5, then he will get another error code and error message. So something like doesn't meet the criteria. If we want, we can take specifically here, instead of taking criteria invalid, we can take username criteria invalid. So that such type of exception constants also we can take. And if I don't pass the password here, and in password check validation, here if I am using that password, I simply want to print that password length. And here I am not passing that password field also. So if I am not passing the password and I am using that length operation on the null object, then I will hit the null pointer exception. But in global exception handler, we have handled the all generic type exceptions also, so it will not throw any unexpected page, and it will give you some error response only here also. So if I hit enter, so still it is taking this one only. So something I will take as now some generic error occurred. So it is showing this type of some generic error message here. So by seeing this console, then developer will understand, okay, where the mistake happened here. By seeing this log files also, he will understand easily. So this is called error handling.